to In Character, a series of conversations between researchers who have been studying moral character. In these videos, two researchers who have been doing different research programs talk about their programs and explore connections between them. I'm Beth Boerger. I'm assistant professor of psychology at Slippery Rock University in Pennsylvania. And I've been studying children's moral behavior, particularly with respect to other children. So I've been looking at peer relationships, aggression, and prosocial behavior between kids.
And I'm Jessica Sommerville. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Washington. I study the development of social and moral cognition and behavior, and in particular, we've been doing a lot of research on how it is that infants and young children develop a sense of fairness and how that relates to their prosocial behavior.
Okay, so to give you an overview of our conversation, we're each going to be talking about our respective research projects as they relate to the development of moral character. And we're also going to be talking about factors that are associated with individual differences in infants and children's moral character. We were both part of the Character Project at Wake Forest University that was run by Christian Miller, Will Fleeson, and Mike Furr, and was funded by the John Templeton Foundation. To start, we'll both give you an overview of our projects, and then I will have questions for Jessica and her research, and she'll have questions for me about mine. So to begin, just to state again what I've already said, we're both developmental psychologists, so we're interested both in characteristics related to moral character that develop in predictable ways at certain times in children's lives, and the factors that help us understand differences in moral behavior and thinking between children. We're also interested in interventions that can promote moral development in children. Jessica's research involves an earlier period in lifespan in mind, so I'll let her tell you a little bit about her research first, and then we'll go on to talk about mine.
Great, thanks, Beth. So the project that I conducted was focused on investigating the very kind of earliest emergence of a sense of fairness in infancy and early childhood. And we were really interested in the development of a sense of fairness in a particular context that is really common and familiar to adults. So that's a context in which people see resources being distributed to recipients and have various opinions about how these resources should be distributed in order for that to be kind of acceptable moral behavior. So one of the things that we know about adults is that when adults participate either in lab-based tasks or they watch other people take part in these tasks, they have expectations about how resources should be distributed in contexts in which little is known about the recipients. And what adults tend to expect and endorse as the right thing to do is that resources should be distributed equally across two recipients. We also know from past work that certainly by about mid-childhood, children have the same kind of notions and intuitions. They also endorse equality in the context of these resource distribution tasks. So in our work, what we really wanted to know is when do you see the kind of very earliest emergence of being concerned about equality when resources are being distributed? We thought that we would look in infancy because there had been a lot of recent work showing that children's kind of social knowledge is more advanced than we might think. And we also thought that some of the previous studies that had been done might have underestimated children's abilities because they used kind of complex paradigms that are more appropriate for adults. And so in our project, what we did is we designed tasks to kind of tap the earliest emergence of fairness and found evidence for a very primitive or basic sense of fairness starting in the second year of life.
Okay, great. I find your research really fascinating.
Thank you.
And I know that there are really quite a lot of challenges involved in studying any cognitive ability in infants, especially you're starting with infants as young as 6 months of age. So it really requires a lot of ingenuity to come up with a way to find out what babies know about fairness. So to start with, you mentioned that there's certain intuitions that adults have about fairness. Could you say a bit about why you chose fairness as the moral concern to study, and why you expected to find evidence of this concept in very young infants?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think maybe to adequately answer that question, I'll back up a little bit and kind of start talk a little bit about the history of studying infants, particularly with respect to kind of early cognitive and social development. So for a very long time, before we had kind of more advanced methods for assessing infants' knowledge and understanding, people really thought that it probably wasn't until children were about 2 years of age, till the end of infancy, that they were able to engage in any sort of symbolic or abstract type of thinking. And that really began to change in the probably late 70s, early 80s, with the advance of new experimental methods to be able to get at what infants are thinking about and what they understand about various events in the world. So that whole wave of research really started by asking not what kids understand about the social world, but what they understand about the physical world. And researchers pioneered a number of different tasks, many of which relied on infants' visual attention to be able to give us information about their understanding of the physical world. One of the surprising things from those findings was that infants' understanding of the physical world was much more advanced than we previously thought. For example, we now know that infants can represent objects when they're not perceptually available from very early in life. We used to think that it wasn't until they were 2 that they could do that. And that early research on physical understanding really provided the tools for researchers to kind of switch topics and start to look at infant social understanding. So the research that was subsequently done began to tell us things like the fact that infants understood a lot about other people's social behavior, that they could understand things like basic mental states, people possess them, that they drive behavior. And this led people, not just our lab, but other labs as well, to start asking whether infants might understand something even broader about some of the norms that govern behavior. And a lot of that work probably started with looking at infants' understanding of basic conventions, like, for example, language labels, and showed that early on, even before infants are necessarily producing words, they seem to understand labels and how they refer to particular objects in the world. The reason that we got interested in fairness is that we thought, it's fairly ubiquitous. Concerns about fairly ubiquitous are ubiquitous not only in adults, but in children's world, right? It's really common to hear kids saying things like, but that's just not fair, even at 3 or 4. And because we thought that when we were reading the past work, that some of the ways that children's understanding of fairness, the ways that they were assessed, maybe were overly complicated for young children, and also really kind of heavily drew on children's own self-interests in a way that might be, I guess, debilitating to younger children and to infants. So that led us to believe that that would be maybe a good candidate for study, given that A, it was ubiquitous, and it seemed like there were some limitations of past studies in terms of being able to nail down the exact emergence of a sensitivity to fairness.
Okay, I can hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so you've talked about the general ideas that led you to study young infants' understanding of fairness. But how do you measure whether babies expect people to distribute things fairly or equally? And how can you be certain that they're really responding to the difference between a fair distribution and an unfair distribution, and not to something else about what they're looking at?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, as you mentioned earlier, of course, studying young infants comes with a whole bunch of different challenges, so you have to be up to the challenge. Infants are, of course, motorically limited, so there's just not a whole lot of behaviors they can actually perform. So you can't have them do advanced motoric things to reveal their knowledge. Most of the infants that we're working with are either pre-verbal or are only just becoming verbal, so you can't just ask them complex questions and expect them to respond. So really what that means is you have to kind of capitalize on existing abilities or modalities and think of kind of creative ways to ask your questions. One of the most commonly used techniques is a technique that relies on infants' visual attention. And it also relies meaning it relies on the fact that infants like to look at things and are willing to look at things, are interested in the world and curious about the world. And it also relies on the fact that adults and older children, when we see something unexpected, we tend to show sustained or prolonged visual attention. So if we see a magician perform a magic trick, we'll stare, right, often in disbelief, indicating that that failed to match our expectations. That shouldn't have happened. If I drop a ball in midair, you or I would stare if it stayed in midair because we think it should fall to the ground. And so using infants' visual attention, increases and decreases in visual attention, is a really good way to get at what they seem to be expecting about the world. Many researchers use this technique. It's called the violation of expectancy technique. So you show infants events that have particular outcomes. One of those outcomes would make sense to adult eyes, and one of them would not make sense to adult eyes. You record how long they look at it. And the idea is if they look longer at the one that doesn't make sense, that suggests that something about that event is violating their expectations. So what we did in our studies is we adapted that really commonly used technique to show infants resource distribution events. And in our studies, what infants would see is they would see video clips where there would be a distributor, let's say I'm the distributor, and 2 recipients, and I might have a bowl of crackers or a pitcher of milk or a box of toys or something like that, some kind of good that I could distribute. And then we would show them these distribution events where the outcome was initially occluded. So we would edit the video so a black box comes up on the screen. Babies can tell that someone is giving away toys or milk or crackers, but what they can't see initially is how the story ends. And then in our studies, what we do is we show infants still frame images that end the stories, and we record how long they look at them. In these studies, we do things like we show infants an equal outcome. So they might see that each recipient got 2 crackers, and we contrast that to an unequal outcome. So maybe someone got 3 crackers and the other person got 1 cracker. And of course, the unequal outcome corresponds to the outcome that adults or older children would say, hey, that's unfair. So the thing that we're looking for is enhanced visual attention, longer looking to that unequal outcome. Now, one of the things you said earlier, right, is the kind of obstacle that we then need to get over. And that is that if infants look longer when people distribute resources unequally, there could be many different reasons for that, not just that they have a sense of fairness, right? So what we then try to do is we run further experiments and we run control conditions where we try to systematically rule out other interpretations. So one of the first interpretations that we sought to rule out was, well, maybe it's just the case that infants look longer at unequal or unfair outcomes because they think that this asymmetry, when there's an asymmetry, that's kind of just visually interesting or something like that. So the way we ruled out that alternative was that we showed infants events where there were asymmetrical outcomes, except there weren't recipients in that case, right? So issues of fairness don't apply. And under those circumstances, we showed that infants don't have a preference for an unequal over an equal outcome. So I guess the general technique is we kind of start off by testing a construct, and then we have to kind of think about what are all of the other things that might explain infants looking if we get a positive result. And we systematically kind of go down the list and construct further experiments to rule out those possibilities.
Okay, great. So, and I think that in your studies, you also made sure that you were looking, you did it within subjects. So you made sure that in the same study, it was the same babies who were looking at the social event, the social distribution event, and the non-social distribution event. And even in the same infant, they were interested when there was uneven distribution that involved people, but not interested when it was just plates of cookies.
Exactly.
So that's really interesting. So I still so one of the questions that comes to mind when I have seen your videos and when I read about it is that okay, so for that's really interesting that babies already at 12, 15 months or whatever are picking up on that difference, specifically when it's a social situation, and noting that that's something unusual. But to really think of that as some beginning of moral concern, it has to go further than that. It has to be not just, wow, I'm not expecting that, but that's not fair.
Right.
You know, that's wrong. That shouldn't happen.
Right.
They did the wrong thing there.
Yeah.
So how do you know that babies are having that sort of evaluative or emotional,
Yeah.
moral outrage response to...
Right. Yep. Yeah. I think that's a great question, and it's such an important distinction, right? Because it could be the case that when infants look longer at unfair outcomes, you know, one thing that could underwrite their response is a basic sense of, like, that just is a low-frequency event in the world, or it just doesn't happen very often, right? And as you said, that's different, that's qualitatively different from what we think of as adults as, like, that's unfair, that's not right. So I think it's really important to be able to design tests where you can sort of say, well, what is the nature of infants' understanding? Is it more like, oh, that's unusual, or is it more like, that's not right? So we've had a number of different techniques that we've used to start to try to get at separating those two different possibilities. One of the techniques that we used in our initial studies was to say, okay, if we want to know that this is really a response that is more like the mature response, where infants are thinking not only that's unusual, but there's something morally off about that, what we can start to do is we can measure other aspects of infants' behavior. So, and we can see if those aspects, those kind of moral aspects of behavior, are linked up in interesting ways with what they do on these violation of expectancy paradigms. So in our initial studies, what we did is we would also give infants a task where they were first allowed to pick one of two toys to determine which of two toys they preferred. And then they were given both of the toys, and an unfamiliar experimenter would come up, and they would make an ambiguous request for the toy. The reason the request was ambiguous is we wanted to see what infants would spontaneously do. So the question is, would they share the toy that they preferred and liked, the more valuable toy, or would they share the one that they did not like so much? So we tend to think of the former, sharing the preferred toy, as more generous or even altruistic, and the sharing of the disliked toy as more selfish or less generous. And then we looked at how that linked up with what infants were doing in the violation of expectancy paradigm. And the interesting thing is we found a really tight linkage, meaning that for infants who were sharing their preferred toy, sharing more generously, they were really the ones who were showing the longest increase in looking to that unfair outcome. And in fact, the infants who were sharing their non-preferred toy tended to really not be as interested in that unequal or unfair outcome. And so what that suggested to us is that, you know, this is kind of one step towards saying, okay, this probably isn't just a response based on, oh, that's unusual. Because if that were the case, there wouldn't really be any reason to think that it would link up to how babies share toys. So that's one thing that we've done. Another thing that we've done is we've tried to convert these paradigms, or we have converted these paradigms, into tasks where after babies see that one person distributes toys or resources fairly and the other person does it unfairly, then babies are allowed to pick who they want to play with of these two actors. And in the moment, what we'll do is after they see these resource distributions, and we'll make sure that those two actors are doing exactly the same thing. So we might do something like, for example, have the two actors simultaneously offer an infant identical bath toys. So they're both acting exactly the same way in the moment, and if infants show a selective preference for the fair actor, what that suggests to us is that they remember something about what happened previously, and there's some type of at least basic evaluation where they're saying, hey, this person is a better person to play with given their past behavior. So those are two techniques that we've used so far. We're trying to now go even further than that, because I think with the preference data showing infants prefer the fair over the unfair actor, I think that it's really important. But I think that you know, a critic could say it still doesn't necessarily get you to the right and wrong piece, right? Because of course adults show preferences all the time, right? Like I can like apples over oranges, but that doesn't mean that I think that apples are right and oranges are wrong, right? So now we're trying to come up with techniques and methods where we look to see whether, for example, infants will tie rewarding stimuli to fair behavior and punishment stimuli to unfair behavior to really get at that right-wrong distinction. And we're finding some interesting positive findings that seem to align with both the looking time results and the preference results in those studies that are just kind of going into the review pipeline right now. So I think that it's a really important question. We're really thinking hard about how do you come up with techniques and methods to try to really parse what exactly is going on.
Yeah, I'm curious, what are the two different types of stimuli and how do you tie them to?
Yeah, so we're doing ways that we think are more implicit and ways that we think are more explicit. So the ways that we think are more implicit, what we've done is we've created a paradigm where babies watch videos, and let's say they say, see me first and I'm distributing goods unfairly, and you go second, you're distributing goods fairly. And then we'll show them on test trials just our faces on two sides of the screen. And from a central speaker, they'll hear vocal stimuli. And the vocal stimuli will either be reward, so they'll hear something like, good girl, you did a good job, you're such a good girl, nice job. Or they'll hear, bad girl, you did a bad job, bad girl, bad job. And then what we do is we look to see, once that stimuli comes on, where infants spontaneously look, and if they shift their attention as a function of the reward and the punishment. And we see in a recent paper that's just kind of in the review pipeline right now, we seem to see positive evidence of that at 13 months of age. So 13-month-olds will shift their attention towards the unfair person when they hear admonishment and the fair person when they hear praise, suggesting that they're starting to kind of line up those constructs of the right, wrong, good, bad with fair and unfair behavior, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it really is. It's fascinating. It's interesting, just to continue here with a little bit of our unplanned conversation. It's interesting to me that you're finding that at 13 months, in part because I read that that's the age when parents really start to to have rules for their babies, and to probably for babies to start to hear things like "good girl" or "no, that's not right." So that's fascinating that's happening at that age. And it relates to another question that I had wanted to ask you, which is about the relation between parents' values, I think, and parents' behaviors and babies' responses.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a
Yeah,
little bit?
sure. Yeah, so we, one of the things that we're really interested in is sort of thinking about how the experiences that babies have might either lead to developmental changes over time or might be associated with individual differences. And, in the long run, one of the things that we'd like to do is get down to the nitty-gritty and actually look at parent-child interactions. And of course, that's really challenging to do because it involves a lot of resources, a lot of time. So as a starting point, what we decided to do is we thought, well, what if we gave parents questionnaires that we think will be relevant to their infant's prosociality and sensitivity to fairness and those sorts of things. And one of the things that we thought might be really relevant is the level of empathy that parents show. Because we thought, well, if you're a more empathic person, that probably changes how you act with your infant versus if you're a less empathic person. So what we've done now across a series of studies is that when infants come in and participate in our task, whether it's a looking time task or a task where they're choosing one of two actors, we have their parents fill out questionnaires that measure both kind of the more emotional aspects of empathy, like their empathic concern, things like when I see someone in distress, I feel badly for them. And also the more kind of cognitive aspects of empathy, like perspective taking, putting yourself in someone else's shoes, understanding someone else's point of view. And the interesting thing that we seem to be finding across those studies is that there are relationships between how high parents are in empathy and the extent to which their infants seem to notice these fairness violations or prefer other people who act fairly, and some aspects of their prosocial behavior, which I think is really interesting and important. We were a little surprised by the findings, not because, at some level they're intuitive, but the thing that is striking to us is these are really different measures, right? So we're having parents independently do, parental report, and we're testing infants on lab-based tasks that take 5 or 10 minutes, and yet you see pretty strong relationships between these two things, which is super duper interesting.
Well, yeah, and what you're asking the parents about is not specifically fairness.
No, exactly.
It's a completely different aspect of their moral attitude.
Exactly, right. It's more about empathy, right, and it's more about their own kind of report of how they think that they are in the world, sort of thing. Ultimately, we think that those individual differences might have an impact on how parents are interacting with infants. So perhaps parents who are, more empathic are more invested in or more frequently demonstrate the emotional reactions, right, of the child's behavior towards them, for example, right, when they're sharing or not sharing or do something more fairly or unfairly, that they might be more systematic in how they kind of provide infants with feedback about that they might be more, they might just engage in more types of prosocial sharing, fair types of behavior that then infants are able to witness or see as demonstrations. So that part of the equation we're still figuring out, but that's kind of our working hypothesis.
Okay, and in the chapter you mentioned an intervention program for parents where you're teaching them to share or do turn-taking games with their infants. Has that started, or is that something?
Yeah, so we have spent the last year, and it's taken a lot of work, coming up with an intervention where we can essentially teach infants how to share. And we were interested in, the reason it's been so challenging is that our goal was to come up with that intervention at an age where infants naturalistically don't demonstrate sharing behavior, right? So if you ask parents, like in naturalistic settings, like if you're asking them about like the very first origins of when is the infant first starting to give you toys, what parents are typically reporting is that the onset of that is at about 9 months of age at home. And so we thought, and if you ask them about younger infants, they'll say at 6 months of age, for example, no, 6, 7 months of age, no, my baby isn't doing any of that. So what we wanted to do is take those 7-month-old infants and see if we could come up with an intervention to actually get them to share before they would be naturalistically sharing. So we've just finished a study that we're just about to submit for publication that is kind of part 1 of this project, where we came up with 2 different interventions, one which was targeted at increasing infant sharing behavior, and a second intervention where we wanted to match a lot of the same characteristics but wasn't about sharing. So in the sharing intervention, babies came in at 7 months, and what we did is we started off by playing a sharing game with them, where experimenters would repeatedly ask them for toys, give them toys. Babies would then watch experimenters share with one another, and then the experimenter would sit down with the parent and do a sharing tutorial, sort of give them tips about playing sharing games with their infants, cues that they can use to encourage their babies to give toys over, things like that, and encourage them to go home and practice as frequently as they could over a 1.5-week period, and then come back at visit 2. And we compared that to a group where, rather than doing a sharing intervention with them, we taught them a game where they would learn to drop objects into a bucket the experimenter held on a board. So the idea is that we're teaching very similar behaviors motorically, right? In both cases they have to release an object, and in both cases they're being rewarded for releasing an object. But one is in the context of this back and forth turn-taking sharing interaction, and the other one is in the context of simply learning to release objects. So our results suggest that we have those babies practice at home too, they all come back, and then they all get the same sharing test at visit 2. And what we're finding is that if the sharing intervention group increases their sharing behavior significantly, they're significantly higher than the control group at the second visit, and actually the control group is still at very low to no rates of sharing. So it seems that those interventions are working, and now we want to sort of expand that to ask, well, like, what are the downstream consequences longitudinally? Does this translate into infants caring about fairness when we measure them on these looking tasks? That's kind of the next step for us.
Okay, that's great. That's really fascinating. And I think you're getting something really important in terms of how they might be able to give guidance to parents about how to interact with their children. Gosh, your research is so fascinating. One of the things that I really found interesting in reading one of your recently published articles from 2013 was looking at helping behavior in babies after you had given them. So you looked at both their looking time through the distribution task. You looked at their sharing, whether they shared at all, whether they shared selfishly or prosocially or altruistically, and then whether they helped an experimenter who had lost the toy, either by pointing at it or helping picking it up. And the well, you can go ahead and tell us something. You know it.
Sure, yeah. So the thing that was interesting in that study is that if you are just interested in the kind of presence or absence of a response on these tasks, for example, like helping the experimenter by pointing, picking up the toy, etc., sharing a toy, those behaviors tend to be interrelated, which means that the babies who are picking up the toy to hand it to the experimenter are the babies that are pointing, or the babies that are giving over a toy. But what seems to be kind of independent is the way that infants, for example, are sharing toys. So if you'll recall in our sharing task, they could choose to share more kind of generously or altruistically by giving over their preferred toy, or they could choose to share their non-preferred toy. That really isn't related to the frequency with which you see these other behaviors. And I think what that means is that we need to kind of think carefully about what we're measuring when we give infants, or anyone really, these kind of prosocial tasks where they're asked to help someone else, right? It could be the case that we, as adult eyes, we think that if we give babies a task and we ask them to help another person and they comply with that and they do it, that they have the prosocial motivation to help. They're motivated to help another person, to meet their needs. And if a baby doesn't do that, they maybe aren't motivated to do that. But I think the issue with those tasks is that there could be other motivations that are really driving infants for performance. So for infants that are doing the tasks, that are engaging in the helping behavior, right, it could be that they want to help another person, or it could be that they're just interested in socially interacting with another person, right? It could have to do with social motivation rather than prosocial motivation. On the other end, the baby that doesn't help the experimenter, it could be because maybe they have prosocial motivation and they want to help, but they just don't know how, or they don't understand the mechanics of the act. So I think what those findings tell us is that we really need to refine our tasks if what we're wanting to get at is the underlying motivation. We need to kind of think hard about how do we kind of zero in on that. I think that's really important.
Okay, yeah, I really, I picked up on that because I think it's also relevant in thinking about what really is prosocial versus just social.
Right.
Not just in infancy, but at any point in the lifespan. So, So I think that it's something that we probably haven't thought about enough when we're looking at what is prosocial behavior and
Yeah.
what leads to prosocial behavior. Okay, so one of the last questions I had for you was looking at really this early sense of moral concern in babies, but making it more complex,
Yeah.
making that goal, that motivation, conflict with some other motivation. And in particular, the motivation of wanting to interact with your own in-group or your own social group rather than another.
Right.
And that certainly is one of, it's certainly an issue that the more we know about how it develops, it's important.
Yeah, right, exactly, yeah. I think, so we did complete a recent study on this where we were kind of, our kind of mindset behind that study is to say, well, in older children and adults, certainly we know that there are all kinds of motivations that kind of compete for our behavior in a sense, right? And sometimes we're motivated by more morally virtuous things, and sometimes we're motivated by other self or kind of group concerns. So our thought was what starts to happen once those things start to come into competition with one another. Are babies sensitive to that, and what happens? And so we used our paradigm where infants would see one person behave fairly and the other behave unfairly, and then they could pick who to play with. And then what we started manipulating was the identity of the person distributing the goods and the identity of the recipients. And so what we found is that when you carefully control all of those things, infants have a systematic preference for a fair person over an unfair person. But once you start to manipulate characteristics that are maybe indicative of being in the same group or another group, in this particular study we manipulated the race of the distributors and the recipients, then things start to look a little bit different. So infants, when, for example, the person doing the distribution is a kind of an other group member, they still care about fairness, but they certainly don't care about it as much as when they don't have to, when those two things don't come into competition. And then the other thing that was interesting that we found, which was surprising to us, we actually hadn't anticipated this, is not only does the kind of group membership of the distributor matter, but the group membership of the recipients matters. Oh. So the thing that was interesting to us is that if the infants learn that a same group member can actually be the beneficiary of inequality, meaning that they can be on the better end, they get the 3 and the other person gets the 1, then infants seem to be more accepting of the distributor under those circumstances, which is really interesting because it suggests that, yeah, they do care about fairness, but they're also thinking about things like, what are the consequences of this distribution and who benefits from the distribution? So I think these findings are super interesting because they suggest that in some ways infants are not, or at least at this age, are not unlike adults where all of these things start coming in to compete and for their behavior and for their attention. So that's pretty interesting, I think.
Yeah, it is. It's this little economic aspect of infants' behavior that socioeconomic that we never imagined that they...
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, could you say a little bit about what you're working on now or what your next steps are?
Yeah, right. So there's kind of 2 directions that we're really heavily pursuing. One I just sort of talked about, which is kind of the intervention ends of things. So we're doing this intervention with parents and infants, and we've also, been coming up with some interventions with parents too. Thinking if we can do interventions with parents that increase empathy, will those have downstream consequences for their infants? And we've conducted just a very small pilot study looking at actually the effects of mindfulness meditation, because other studies have shown increases in parental empathy when folks do mindfulness meditation interventions. And under those circumstances, we don't have a lot of great information about what's happening with infants yet, but we do see changes in parental empathy. So the next step would be to ask, are those trickling down, and what other types of interventions might be effective with parents? That's kind of one line of work. Another line of work is really trying to, go further in terms of getting at the nature of the underlying representation. So I talked a little bit about using this technique to try and get at the reward punishment. So the other thing that we're doing in that line of studies is coming up, we think that's more of an implicit thing, we want to come up with more of an explicit thing, where babies are actually the person doing the rewarding or the punishing. And that's challenging because to set up a scenario like that is fairly complicated, right? If we were to sort of set up a play scenario and give babies the option of punishing or rewarding, that's complicated. So what we're doing in that line of studies is we've kind of turned to a new technique where we are teaching infants how to use touch screens. We've set up this kind of touch screen program where infants will first learn that if they press one side of the screen, a bar on one side of the screen, it elicits praise, and if they press the other side of the screen, it elicits punishment. And then after they've learned that, they see clips of a person acting fairly or another person acting unfairly. Then what happens on test is one of the distributor's face comes up. And then they have their reward and punishment bars. What do they do? So that seems like a kind of first step in that direction, which of course is you know, it's no mean feat to get to the place of babies using touchscreens in the first place. Yeah. But we do have some interesting results so far. These are with 16-month-old infants, showing that at least for these fair-unfair scenarios, infants tend to like to reward the fair person, but we don't yet see evidence that they're punishing the unfair person. They tend to be kind of equal between the two. So we're trying to further understand that. Like, is that really about infants' reward and punishment, or is there something about our technique that isn't tapping it? But I think that's something we're really interested in knowing about, is when, given the opportunity, when will infants begin to intervene, and do their interventions look like adults, or do they look different?
Yeah. So in the touchscreen thing, I would imagine that it would be harder to teach the babies to touch the one that gives punishment, because they don't like to hear the punishment. Is that true?
That doesn't seem to be the case. You know, one of the things that we realized, we're adapting our methods a little bit now, because one of the things that occurred to us is that, you know, with this verbal stimuli, right, it's sort of like, and you're sort of alluding to this, like when you push that, not only could it be directed at the person in the middle, right, but you also have to hear it, which might not be so pleasant, right? So now we're trying to think of ways to come up with that you could reward or punish someone where you can kind of give them a consequence, but it doesn't necessarily have a consequence for you, right? You're kind of immune to that. Just to see if there's something about just punishment being aversive, so babies not wanting to hear it, for example. So we're trying to think now through the mechanics of, like, how do you do that, right? So, yeah, I think it's a good point.
Okay, well, very good. And good luck with the further research that you're doing on this topic.
Thanks so much. Great. Well, should we switch things around now, Beth, and maybe you can say a little bit about what you're working on, and then I'll ask you some questions about your work?
Okay, great. So my research is different from yours in a couple of different ways. One, I'm working with much older children. The project that I did for the Character Project involved kids from 3rd grade through 7th grade in a public school. So their ages were between 8 years and 14 years of age. Another thing that's different about my research from what you're doing is that I conducted it in the school.
Yeah.
I didn't have any of the experimental control that you have when you develop laboratory tasks. I was using basically survey methods of studying kids and interviewing them about their own knowledge, their own sense of self, and then interviewing them also about the other kids that they knew who were in the study, and having them nominate other children from their grade who were in the study who had various characteristics, including whether they tended to often hit others or steal from them or call them names or help them, share with them, stand up for them, or even whether they were getting hit or kicked or hurt by other kids. So in that sense, it was a much different type of study from what you were doing. What I was looking at in some ways was not too different. I was looking at what individual difference factors would help to predict which kids were more aggressive and which kids were more prosocial. And I was looking particularly at what children understand with respect to other people's mental states, other people's emotions, and the relations between mental states and emotions, which is called theory of mind. Theory of mind, as you know, we begin to see evidence of it in babies. And it does develop a lot during the preschool years and then into elementary school. So I wanted to see how that would affect kids' social behavior. I also was interested in a much less studied phenomenon in kids, which is referred to as moral identity. And this is something that's recently begun to be studied a fair amount in adolescents and adults, but not so much yet in children. It refers to the extent to which having moral traits, being a moral person, is really important to an individual's sense of self, so that they actually will feel good, feel like they are being their true self when they do something that's morally good, and feel a reduction in self-esteem, or feel a reduction in their sense of self when they do something that's morally wrong. So this should be something that's very motivating toward moral behavior if it's characteristic. But it's something that it's a capacity to relate to what we talked about with the babies, where they may have a sense of moral fairness, but there might other times be other sorts of goals that are more predominant. So moral identity is one aspect, or one thing that can be important to your sense of self, but there are also other things like your achievement goals or your status goals, so which unfortunately I didn't measure. But I wanted to see how the moral identity part of it affected kids' behavior, and particularly if there would be an interaction with those theories of mind. So that's an overview of my study.
Thanks. That's great. I really love your work. And in reading your work, one of the things I had kind of known this from some previous readings, but had forgotten about it and was struck by this again. You do a lot of work on theory of mind, and one of the things that and how it influences kids' character development and moral behavior. And I think one of the striking findings in that arena is that although it's kind of intuitive to think that more theory of mind, better theory of mind translates into more or better prosocial behavior, one of the things you discussed in your chapter is that sometimes having an advanced or sophisticated theory of mind isn't actually a predictor of acting prosocially, but it might be a predictor of like almost Machiavellian or bullying type of behavior. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that, because I find the fact that it can kind of go in two ways really interesting, and why you think it can predict in both directions in a sense.
Yeah, and that's really the question that got me interested in the character project and in this study to begin with, because like a lot of people who've studied theory of mind and development in theory of mind, especially looking from preschoolers into school-age kids, the idea is you expect that it helps them. That as they really begin to understand other people's mental states and other people's emotions and how their own behavior affects it, they'll get better at managing their social relationship. And there is some research that suggests that that's partially true. In fact, there some of the best research looking at that question recently has come from Marcella Papuki and Robin Banerjee in some longitudinal studies they've done, looking at differences before the trajectory of development in peer relationships between children who have good, relatively highly developed theory of mind abilities at the end of preschool, and how that affects them as they move into elementary school. And the results suggest that for the children who have better theory of mind abilities when they're 4 or 5, before they've actually started school, when they begin school, they do show more prosocial behavior than the other children, and they're liked more by their peers. And that builds on itself, so that as they move through school, they're more liked. They show more prosocial behavior. They're liked more by their peers, presumably because they're liked more by their peers. They have more opportunities to interact with peers and be socially involved and show prosocial behavior and use their theory of mind to resolve conflicts and all those things that we hope that theory of mind would allow children to do. So for the kids who start out with a good theory of mind early, it does seem to at least help them to adjust to the peer network and be liked, to be accepted by their peers. For kids who start out behind, they do seem to fall further and further behind, to be more rejected by their peers, possibly even victimized by their peers, so that there's more of a deficit as they go. And I think one of the things that's really been crucial in that research study is longitudinal. It's been very difficult to really find real differences in the social consequences of theory of mind if you're only looking at kids at at things concurrently. But that research only shows that more advanced theory of mind enables kids to do the type of social things that allow them to have friends. And that it does tend to lead to their having friends. It doesn't show anything about whether they're also doing things that might not be nice to other kids. So they didn't measure aggression, so we really don't know what else they're doing. Now, there is plenty of research showing that there is a dark side to theory of mind. And even beginning with one of the things that we measure in theory of mind, one of the crucial theory of mind measures is coming to understand false beliefs when you're about 4 years of age. Coming to understand that people can have false beliefs about the world and how to create false beliefs about the world. So when kids acquire that knowledge, they tend to start to lie more. As they get older and acquire more complex understanding of how false beliefs are obtained and who will have a false belief and that they can have false beliefs about other people's beliefs, they get better at lying. So increases in theory of mind during elementary school do differentiate between kids who can lie convincingly in the face of counter evidence and kids who cannot. So that by itself does indicate that becoming more advanced in theory of mind at least permits you to do things that are potentially antisocial. It's also the case that as kids acquire more complex theory of mind, they begin to understand nonverbal language better, and that includes things like sarcasm and irony. And I don't know, I remember an interaction with my 9-year-old niece when she first discovered sarcasm, which made me want to say, yes, dear, I know you have a theory of mind, but I do too. You don't have to demonstrate it. Because sometimes with really bright 9 and 10-year-olds, they really tend to be very cuttingly sarcastic and ironic in every social interaction. And in terms of their interaction with peers, that might make them better at choosing just the right name, just the right insult to use toward kids they want to dominate or put down, that can make them more effective as bullies. And that does seem to be the case, because we do know that when we're looking specifically at bullying versus other ways that kids can respond to bullying by either supporting the bully or standing up for the person who's being bullied, both the kids that are actually leading the bully and the kids who are willing to stand up and help the bully tend to be pretty strong in theory of mind, and perhaps stronger than other kids in the class. Whereas kids that tend to be victims sometimes are a little bit less strong in theory of mind. So learning about that really did inspire me to want to understand, well, why would some kids who have these abilities choose to use them to hurt other kids toward evil ends, and why would others forego the opportunities to use them for evil ends and instead use them mostly for prosocial ends, which is why I started looking at their moral motivation as well. One thing that I realized after doing my study that I really hadn't thought much about in advance, that often when we think about aggression and prosocial behavior, we really think of them as opposites and of a single continuum. But in terms of kids' real lives, and probably our real lives too, they're not. The same person can be involved in prosocial behavior and in aggression, and there are some categories of bullies we know from studies, especially with kids as they're getting into 4th, 5th, 6th grade, who combine aggression and prosocial behavior. A lot of prosocial behavior toward their friends, toward other kids who are high-status kids, and then really systematically target the aggression toward children who are more socially isolated or vulnerable. So that's another complication there. And in fact, probably there is some evidence that it is the kids who have more understanding of theory of mind or social information processing, who are more adept at that sort of splitting of who they respond positively to and who they respond negatively to.
Yeah.
So I've talked a lot about the background. I did want to say that my findings with just this one group of 3rd through 7th graders do support most of what I've talked about here about how theory of mind is related to aggression and prosocial behavior in middle childhood. I did find that children who were higher in theory of mind were liked better by their peers. Other children wanted to play with them more, wanted to work on them with projects more. I also found that they were higher in prosocial behavior.
Yeah. Interesting.
And the link between theory of mind and being liked really did seem to be driven by that prosocial behavior.
Oh, interesting.
So when I included the prosocial behavior in looking at the link between theory of mind and being liked, the theory of mind then went away. It was all completely accounted for by the prosocial
Wow,
behavior.
that's really interesting.
Cool. And I didn't find any connection between theory of mind and aggression overall when I was looking at the composite factor that I found. But when I looked separately at peers' nominations for how often kids use what might be seen as relatively immature forms of aggression, hitting, name calling,
right.
Those were negatively related to theory of mind, whereas the others weren't, and that disappeared when I combined them all together. So it suggests that maybe part of what happens is that as kids acquire more theory of mind, that some of the sort of immature, I wanted to hit you, aggression drops out, but more sophisticated aggression.
Right, I see what you mean,
Replace it. Kids are inclined toward aggression.
That makes sense, yeah. That's great. Well, thank you for that. I think a really cool thing about your work and a really kind of significant advance is how you're thinking about moral identity and how that interacts with a theory of mind. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about moral identity. One of the things that I thought was really interesting and careful about your chapter is trying to separate out or disentangle the construct of moral identity from moral agency. So maybe we could start with that. How is moral identity different from moral agency?
Okay, yeah, so actually that was a large part of how I spent last summer, was trying to figure that out. So what moral identity is, and the way that it's talked about when we're talking about moral identity in adolescents or adults, it is, one part of it is the sense that you really internalize the ideas of moral traits, and those are actually your sense of what your ideal self would be. So that's moral internalization. Right. So it's sometimes talked about as being really a merging of your understanding of morals and self, so you can differentiate them, or that it's much, much tightly part of your sense of self. And that's really seen as being something people have always talked about, as something that comes in adolescence as part of the general identity development process that's taking place in adolescence and early adulthood. So when I had decided to use this moral identity measure, looking at moral self-concept in these younger kids, and my research suggests that, yeah, they really do already at 9 to 10 years of age maybe have this differentiation, individual differences in the extent to which their sense of morality is part of how they see themselves. But then I really felt that I needed to track that downwards to have a sense of where does it come from, and how do individual differences in it develop. So what I came up with in the chapter is that we know that, well, one thing is this concept of moral agency. And this has been defined by other researchers as involving several components. So to have a sense of moral agency, it means that you understand what moral values or moral norms are, you know, how you should behave as a moral person. You understand the link between your own desires, thoughts, and intentions and behavior that has good and bad outcomes. So you don't just hit someone else, kind of in a reactive way, and then say, oh yeah, and then get punished. You're actually able to link what you did that had a bad moral effect to your previous desires and intentions. And it's that link between your behavior and its outcomes on the one hand, and your intentions on the other, that really is moral authority. That really is what makes you a moral agent, makes you responsible for the good and bad outcomes of your action. And it seems to be so we know that and this is a theory of mine thing, that prior to something between 5 and 7 years of age, kids have relatively little awareness of their ongoing stream of consciousness.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult for children when they're reflecting on conflicts that they've been involved in or things that they've done that have hurt other people to remember what they were thinking prior to, or what to really answer the question why you did that. So a lot of little kids are kind of, well, you know, I did it. She hit my toy, I hit it. That's that. He cried. That's it. All behavior. When they are able to begin to piece together intentions and desires and emotions, then they can start to talk about, well, we were playing, and he wanted to play with my brand new truck, but it's my brand new truck, it's my best thing, and I didn't want to give it to him, so I hit him, and then he was really sad and cried, and then I felt bad. When that happens, then they really can be said to be a moral agent, to have moral responsibility in a way that they didn't when they weren't able to think those things up. So that's my concept of moral agency. It's an important, if I'm right about how that happens, it's an important step forward in kids' moral development, but it's an early step. What happens later is that kids begin to understand this idea that there are choices about which of your goals you're going to, or which part of your identity, which part of yourself you're going to attend to or respond on the basis of at a given time. And then it's that selecting the moral self, the moral identity from the other options that are available to you, that's implied by moral identity.
Nice. I like that. Right. So it sounds like a...
And then the other step in between there, in terms of the research that we currently have, which is there are kind of the gaps in it, but in terms of the research that we currently have, we know that around sometime between 6 and 8, at least in most Western samples, there's a change in the way that kids make predictions about how they or another person would feel after harming another person. So it's called the happy victimizer phenomenon. Where younger kids, if they're told a story about a child who wants to swing and so pushes Tommy off the swing and then gets the swing for himself, and then they're asked, well, how does he feel? They'll say he feels happy, and it's because he's gotten what he initially wanted. Even if they've already said that it's wrong for him to push Tommy off the swing. As they get a little older, then they do say, no, he feels bad, and they focus in on the moral component of the emotion, the feeling guilty, the feeling remorse, the feeling that you shouldn't have caused someone else to be hurt. And that seems to be, I'm hypothesizing that may be associated with the shift from...
That's so interesting,
not yet being able to link your actions back to your intentions, the pre-moral agency stage, to being able to say that you are a moral agent.
That's really interesting, I think it's interesting that you see these kind of fairly early individual differences in moral identity, and I wonder if you have thoughts about, you know, what is responsible for kids either being higher or lower in moral identity? Are there sorts of things one could do to promote kids being higher in moral identity?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and it's one that I don't think that there's good research point to, to guide you. But in thinking about it, I think that it may come down to something, in some ways it's more similar to what you talk about in terms of how parents might sort of promote more of a step toward a more moral perspective. So I think one thing that I've seen in reading the moral identity literature with adults is that for people who are higher in moral identity, there's just much more willingness to forgive. There's much more willingness to show compassion for people who might otherwise be seen as your enemies, such as after 9/11, Iraqis or Afghanistan's civilians. Much more of a degree of selflessness. So it seems that really adopting a moral identity puts you in a direction of valuing yourself a little bit less and other people a little bit more. So that when it comes to situations where you might otherwise pursue achievement goals or personal advancement goals, that you're more inclined to pursue the moral goals. So what can parents do or what can teachers do to promote that? Well, I think that they need to model it. They need to behave in ways toward the children that support choosing things that are maybe not just equitable, but maybe favorable to the other, favorable to someone who's not, the child's friend rather than the child. Maybe by even sort of showing a child, actually I haven't thought of specific things. that's really the tough thing to do, but probably with encouraging sharing. It does seem that giving children opportunities to share in ways that involves at least probably there's an optimal amount of cost for the sharing for it to really contribute to their sense of moral identity. You don't want, and an example here is a couple weeks ago I was at a family reunion and my 5-year-old nephew decided that he really loved all his aunts and uncles and he wanted to share something with us. So he brought out he had some candy and he brought out this little bowl of candy and said, "Oh, you can have some of my treats." But then he realized, oh no, my Spider-Man treats at the bottom there. And he cried. And my brother had to come and say, no, Andrew wants to tell you that he doesn't really want to give up his Spider-Man treats. So he's a little bit of selfish sharing. And I think that probably there's some sweet point where a child is having an opportunity to give up something where there is a cost to themselves. But not such a big cost that it's going to end up with what they remember being, oh, I lost my Spider-Man. My Spider-Man treats and I'll never have them again. And I'm devastated. So I think helping kids to recognize opportunities for sharing and supporting a degree of sacrifice in sharing is probably something that helps to put kids on that pathway. Another thing that I think probably is part of it, and this goes back to Martin Hoffman's work on empathy and moral development, is disciplining kids in a way that they're making connections between their thoughts and their behavior and what happened to someone else, and especially what that made someone else feel like. So they're starting to internalize it. So they are having those mental representations of how their behavior affects other people and the difference between good and bad behavior. And that they are learning to experience guilt when they do cause other people harm. So those are some things that I think are probably important, but I know that there's a lot more that needs to be done to figure out how we can support.
That's really cool. That's neat. One of the things I know, from reading a little bit of the theory of mind literature is that there's been some pretty tight linkages demonstrated between executive function and theory of mind. And I'm just wondering if you had ever thought about kind of incorporating EF measures into your own work, given that those linkages and your kind of findings of the importance of theory of mind and moral behavior and that sort of thing.
Yeah, to be honest, no, I haven't. But because you asked, I did read some more of the literature on executive function and theory of mind, especially, I mean, I think initially when people were looking at the relation between executive function and theory of mind, they were looking in preschoolers and looking at this sort of earlier level, and there was less of a literature on relations between executive function and theory of mind, or executive function and behavior in middle childhood and then on into adolescence and adulthood. But that's really starting to build up. And it does seem that with the more advanced theory of mind tasks, as well as with the ones that we use in preschool, there is a link with working memory as part of it, because the more advanced tasks, and I think using theory of mind in real life too requires keeping in mind perspectives of several people at the same time, or several different aspects of a social situation at the same time. So it requires thinking about a lot at once, and I think working memory is probably really involved there, and also inhibitory control. So I think those would be important things to look at in terms of how they relate to the theory of mind, if theory of mind does relate to differences in moral reasoning or moral behavior, and also just to see how they relate directly.
I guess my thought on it was something like, there may be kids who are kind of high in moral identity, right? But on the other hand, they might have trouble when something has a really potentially high personal consequence or benefit, right? They might have trouble enacting that. So I wondered if that's where something like EF or inhibitory control could come in somewhere there.
Interesting,
So I could imagine two kids, both who are really saying, acting in this way makes me feel really good, right? But one better in kind of inhibitory control, so they can actually enact that a little bit more successfully.
And I think that's a good point on the basis of my finding, because what I did find with respect to moral identity and aggression and also theory of mind is that it really seemed that moral identity alone didn't have that much to do with aggression in kids who were relatively low in theory of mind, which indicates to me that there is some level of cognitive development, perhaps all related to the social aspect of theory of mind, but also perhaps to working memory and inhibitory control that makes it possible for kids to act in ways that are consistent, and possibly to inhibit aggression. One of the things that I've found, just looking at this data in more complex ways in the past few weeks, is that part of what's going on in the story about theory of mind, moral identity, and aggression is that both moral identity and theory of mind are more important among kids who are higher in victimization.
I see.
So for kids who are very low in victimization, they're not that involved in it. There's a lower level of aggression for that group anyway, and neither moral identity or theory of mind really seems to come into play there, possibly because they're not that needed. But in moderate levels of victimization or high levels of victimization, there really moral identity seems to come into play. And at the highest level of victimization, both theory of mind and moral identity seem to come into play. So it seems that as kids are experiencing more situations in which behaving aggressively is really tempting or is really what most people would do, then they need more. They need more resources to not behave that way.
Right. That makes sense. So can you say a little bit about what you think you'll do next, or what would be what you're doing right now that you're kind of most interested in or passionate about?
So I have to say that when I started this project, it really was, I was interested in theory of mind. That was really what brought me into it. Why doesn't theory of mind lead to good behavior instead of bad? I come out of it being really interested in the moral identity.
Oh, interesting. That's great.
And what I really am interested in is beginning to put together. So I in my chapter, I did begin to lay out a theoretical idea about how earlier aspects of children's moral knowledge and positive internalization of parents' rules
Yep.
Feed into later moral agency and moral identity. But I haven't really got it worked out so those pieces completely fit together, and I have some suggestive data
Right.
at one point, but I really start to try looking more at what's happening developmentally as kids do kind of diverge from some kids that really have this more strong moral perspective or free identity, and some that are not. And then after that would be a look at what parents can do, what teachers can do to kind of push kids in the right direction.
Yeah.
And there's some different ages where I think it's really might be a challenge to think about what can be done to support moral identity. So I am interested at the adolescent level too to think about what's happening there, because adolescents, they don't want to be seen as goody goody. They don't want to be seen as being too tied to their parents' rules.
Right, right.
So it seems that at that age, when kids are establishing identities and symbolizing their entities, displaying their identities to the rest of the world, this might be an identity that kids are kind of like saying, oh no, that's not me. So I kind of like to look at what's happening there. What enables kids to kind of come out as people with a moral identity, and is there something like a coming out?
Yeah, right.
Some aspect to it. So those are some of the things that I'm.
Yeah, that's great. Super fascinating. Well, thank you so much. I feel like we should probably wrap up now, but I really enjoyed talking to you and learning more about your work. It's really fascinating, and I'm so excited to see what you have kind of coming down the pipeline.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed talking with you about your work too.
Okay, great.
It's been fun.